Resident Evil's most brutal scene, the laser corridor, it was not CGI at all. It was a full body mold of an actor, cut into cubes, and pulled apart piece by piece on camera. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. These are 20 Resident Evil secrets that made this movie iconic. Number 20. Now this is a detail that makes every die-hard fan go berserk. When the first Resident Evil movie was announced, many people expected to see the familiar faces from the games leading the story. Characters like Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, and the STARS team were what fans had in mind.
Chris!
But when the movie finally arrived, the main character was someone completely new. Alice was never in the games. She was created specifically for the movie so the filmmakers could tell their own story without being locked into the complicated game canon. Now, on paper, that sounds like a smart move. But back in 2001, fans were pissed. Many players felt the movie had ignored the characters they loved. Ironically, the character that fans once complained about eventually became the face of the entire movie franchise. 6 films later, Alice turned into one of the most recognizable action heroines of the 2000s. If you were a fan back then, were you okay with Alice leading the story, or did it bother you too? Number 19. You know exactly the moment I am talking about. That eerie little girl's voice echoes through the Hive. Calm, flat, almost bored. And then she drops the line, "You are all going to die down here."
You're all going to die down here.
It was diabolical. That delivery was not random. The filmmakers wanted the voice to feel deeply unsettling. It combined the sound of an innocent child with complete apathy. Your brain expects warmth or fear from a child's voice, but instead you get something cold and mechanical. To make it even creepier, the voice was digitally adjusted so it would feel like something pretending to be a child rather than an actual child speaking. And clearly it worked. That line became one of the most memorable moments in the entire Resident Evil movie franchise. Number 18. Moving on, answer honestly. Did the laser corridor scene feel strangely familiar? Yeah, there is a reason for that. The idea was partly inspired by the 1997 Canadian horror film Cube. In that movie, the environment itself becomes the killer, with deadly geometric traps built directly into the architecture. Resident Evil borrowed that same concept and turned it into one of the most unforgettable sequences in the entire film. And the effect that shocked everyone was far more practical than you might think. The crew actually built a full-body mold of actor Colin Salmon. They then cut that mold into dozens of small cubes and suspended each piece on individual rods in front of a green screen. When the cameras rolled, the rods were slowly pulled apart, separating the pieces and creating that horrifying cube effect on screen. It is wild when you think about it. One of the most technically complicated horror scenes of the early 2000s was essentially a foam dummy being pulled apart by sticks. Number 17. Here is something most people do not realize about the zombies in the film. They were not just random extras covered in makeup. No, in fact, many of them were professional dancers. And that decision was very intentional. Playing a convincing zombie requires a surprising amount of body control. You need to know exactly where every limb is so you can move in ways that feel unnatural. Stiff movements and broken rhythms. The kind of motion that makes the body look biologically wrong. So, director Paul Anderson brought in trained dancers who could precisely control their movements and make the undead look disturbingly real. And when the production still needed more zombies, something even funnier happened. Several Capcom executives ended up putting on zombie makeup and walking straight into the crowd scenes themselves, which means somewhere in those shots, the very people behind the Resident Evil games were shambling around on screen as the undead. Number 16. It might be hard to imagine now, but before filming even started, the studio was unsure about casting Milla Jovovich as Alice. At the time, she was best known for her role in The Fifth Element, where she played a mysterious and stylized alien character. That didn't exactly scream survival horror action hero. The studio had doubts, but director Anderson fought hard to keep her in the role. She went through 3 months of intense training just to perform one specific moment in the film. The scene where Alice runs up a wall and kicks a zombie dog in the head. And she did not stop there. Almost every bruise and cut you saw on Alice during the movie, it was real. Milla actually asked the filmmakers not to hide them with makeup because she wanted the character to look like she had genuinely survived a nightmare. Anderson's instinct was right. Alice went on to become the face of the entire Resident Evil film franchise. Speaking of casting decisions that almost broke this movie, wait until you hear who was originally supposed to play the male lead when we get to number 2. Number 15. Back in 2001, digital effects were exploding. The Matrix had just changed the game, and suddenly every studio wanted CGI in every action scene. But when it came to Resident Evil, director Anderson made a very deliberate decision to go the opposite direction. Instead of leaning heavily on computers, the film used practical effects wherever possible. The zombies you see on screen were created with full prosthetic makeup, real textures, and physical gore effects rather than digital shortcuts. That choice is a big reason the horror still feels grounded today. Even the creatures that required CGI were built physically first. The Licker, for example, used computer animation for its movement, but its surface details were based on physical models so it would still look believable under the lighting. And those terrifying zombie dogs? They were not digital creations. They were real Dobermans wearing specially designed latex zombie makeup. That commitment to practical effects gave the film a gritty, tactile feel that later sequels struggled to replicate. When you compare the first movie to the more CGI-heavy entries that came later, you can immediately feel the difference. The horror feels more real, and that was completely intentional. Number 14. Here is a detail that explains why the zombies in the first Resident Evil movie still hold up so well today. Director Anderson gave the cast a very specific instruction about how to approach them. These were not supposed to be monsters. They were supposed to be people whose bodies had been destroyed by a virus. That distinction completely changed the performances. Instead of exaggerated horror movie movements, the actors playing zombies were told to move like something was biologically wrong with them. Slower reactions, stiff limbs, and motions that looked damaged rather than theatrical. The concept was that the T-virus did not magically turn humans into creatures. It broke the human body and left something tragic behind. Because they were not playing scary, they were playing broken. And that difference makes the horror hit much harder. Number 13. Most of the underground world of the Hive was built on massive sound stages at Adlershof Studios in Berlin. Entire corridors, laboratories, and control rooms were constructed from scratch so the filmmakers could create that cold, sterile environment beneath the Umbrella Corporation facility. But the production also used a real location that added even more realism to the film. Several scenes were shot inside an actual unfinished Berlin subway station called U-Bahnhof Bundestag. At the time, it was still under construction, which meant the crew had access to raw tunnels, exposed concrete, and dark industrial spaces that perfectly matched the tone of the story. Then history interrupted the production. The film's final sequence, where Alice wakes up to a devastated Raccoon City, was delayed after the events of September 11th. When filming resumed, post-production artists digitally removed almost all visible life from 2 entire city blocks to create that eerie sense of abandonment. In a strange way, the final apocalyptic tone of the ending was shaped by a moment of real-world grief. Number 12. Believe it or not, Resident Evil was not originally supposed to be called Resident Evil. Early in production, the film actually had a different title, Resident Evil: Ground Zero. Marketing materials referenced it, and the official website for the movie even launched under that name in March 2001. At the time, the title made sense. The story centers around the original outbreak of the T-virus, essentially the starting point of the entire disaster. Calling it Ground Zero was meant to emphasize that this was where everything began. But then September 11th happened, and the phrase Ground Zero suddenly carried an entirely different meaning across the world. Releasing a zombie horror film with that title only months after the attacks would have felt incredibly insensitive. So the studio made a quiet decision. The subtitle was dropped completely, and the movie was released simply as Resident Evil. It is one of those small behind-the-scenes changes that most people never notice, but it shows how real-world events can reshape pop culture in unexpected ways. And if you're here for casting drama, the George Romero story is still coming. Capcom said something about it that was absolutely ruthless. Number 11. If you ever felt slightly lost while watching the characters move through the Hive, that feeling was completely intentional. Production designer Richard Bridgeland designed the underground facility to be psychologically confusing. Many of the corridors were built to look almost identical, with repeating shapes and sterile white walls that made it difficult to tell where one hallway ended and another began. The bright clinical surfaces were also part of the strategy. White environments reflect light, which means every shadow, smear of blood, and movement becomes far more visible. Instead of hiding the horror in darkness, the design forces you to see it clearly. The more sterile the room looks, the more disturbing it becomes when something violent happens inside it. And perhaps the most important design choice was keeping almost the entire story underground. By trapping the characters beneath the surface, the film removes any sense that help might arrive. No sunlight, no outside world, just endless corridors, and the feeling that the exit is always somewhere out of reach. In many ways, the Hive itself becomes the real monster of the film. Number 10. When director Anderson started thinking about the sound of Resident Evil, he did not want a traditional orchestral horror score. In fact, his main reference point was the minimalist electronic sound used by filmmakers like John Carpenter. Carpenter's films often use simple but aggressive synth patterns that created tension without relying on big orchestras. And Anderson wanted that same cold, mechanical feeling for the world of the Hive. To build that sound, he brought together composer Marco Beltrami and an unexpected collaborator, Marilyn Manson. At first glance, it might seem like Manson would simply inject his usual industrial rock style into the film. But according to behind-the-scenes interviews, he approached the project much more like a traditional film composer than a rock musician. He experimented with what he described as biological textures for scenes involving the T-virus, harsh authoritarian tones to reflect the Umbrella Corporation, and eerie childlike motifs connected to the Red Queen. The result is one of the most overlooked horror scores of the early 2000s, and it quietly shapes the mood of the entire movie. Number 9. Today, zombie movies and television shows feel like they are everywhere. But when the first Resident Evil movie was being made, that was not the case at all. In fact, director Anderson once pointed out in an interview with Thrillist that when production began, the zombie genre had been mostly dormant for about 15 years. That made Resident Evil a bit of a gamble. It was not just adapting a video game. It was trying to revive an entire horror genre that had largely disappeared from mainstream cinema. When the film was finally released in March 2002, the gamble paid off. Made for around $33 million, the movie went on to earn more than $100 million worldwide. Suddenly, studios realized that audiences were ready for zombies again, and what followed is almost like a chain reaction. Later that same year, 28 Days Later arrived and redefined modern infected horror. A couple of years later came the remake of Dawn of the Dead. Soon after that, audiences got the comedy twist of Shaun of the Dead. Eventually, television jumped in with the massive success of The Walking Dead. Number 8. The very first voice you hear in the movie is calm, clinical, and strangely detached. It explains the T-virus, the Umbrella Corporation, and the disaster that is about to unfold. What many viewers never realize is that the person delivering that opening narration is actor Jason Isaacs.
At the beginning of the 21st century, the Umbrella Corporation had become the largest commercial entity in the...
What makes this even more interesting is the timing. This was just 4 months after he played Lucius Malfoy in Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and here he was again, lending his voice to another cold and intimidating presence. But in Resident Evil, you never actually saw his face. The narration was delivered while Isaacs was wearing a gas mask, and the role itself went uncredited. That choice ties into another visual idea the filmmakers had for the Umbrella Corporation's sanitation team. Their masks were designed with mirrored eyepieces so the audience could never see their eyes or expressions. The result was subtle but effective. Umbrella came across as something colder and more impersonal, almost like a machine carrying out orders. Stick around for number 2 to find out which actor turned down the lead in Resident Evil to stay on a vampire show. Number 7. The look of Alice in the first Resident Evil movie became instantly recognizable, but the costume almost looked very different. Early designs for the character's dress were actually blue. The inspiration came from the classic fairy tale imagery of Alice from Alice in Wonderland. In fact, the filmmakers were deliberately referencing the character's name and the idea of someone falling into a strange and dangerous world. But once production started building the sets for the Hive, the costume team realized something important. The entire environment was filled with cold white corridors, sterile laboratory walls, and bright clinical lighting. Against that background, a blue dress did not stand out very much, so the decision was made to switch the color to red. Suddenly, the character popped visually against the pale surroundings of the facility. Every time Alice moved through those white corridors, the red dress made her instantly recognizable on screen. The change was so last minute that costume adjustments were still happening during the first week of filming. In the end, though, the red dress became one of the most iconic visual elements of the entire franchise. Number 6. Before Resident Evil, most zombie stories followed a very simple survival formula. Characters ran, hid, and tried to escape. Fighting back usually meant grabbing the nearest blunt object and hoping for the best. Alice was different. She fought with precision and technique, almost like a trained martial artist. That style was not accidental. To prepare for the role, actress Milla trained with Robin Shou, who many fans recognize as Liu Kang from Mortal Kombat. Director Anderson had worked with Shou on that earlier movie and brought him back specifically to help design Alice's combat style. Shou trained Milla in choreographed movements that mixed martial arts with cinematic action techniques. That training shaped how Alice moved throughout the film. Her kicks, spins, and quick reactions were all carefully practiced so they would look believable during intense scenes with the infected creatures. Strangely, that means Alice's fighting style carries a bit of Mortal Kombat DNA. Number 5. When audiences first watched the ending of Resident Evil, it felt like the beginning of something bigger. Alice wakes up alone in a hospital, walks through a ruined city, picks up a shotgun, and pushes open the doors to a devastated Raccoon City. It looks exactly like the opening chapter of a much larger story, and that was completely intentional. Director Anderson has openly explained that the ending was designed as a gamble. At the time, the studio had not officially approved any sequels. There was no guarantee the story would continue beyond the first movie, but Anderson believed strongly that the world of Resident Evil had franchise potential. So instead of wrapping everything up neatly, he structured the final moments as a launch point. The destroyed city, the empty streets, and Alice stepping into a post-apocalyptic world were meant to make audiences feel like the real story was only just beginning. When the movie went on to earn more than $100 million worldwide, that gamble paid off. And that door that opened in 2002 stayed open for a long time. The franchise continued for 16 years and eventually grew into one of the most successful video game film series ever made. Number 4. Interestingly, the ending audiences saw in theaters was not the only version that existed during development. Earlier drafts of the script imagined a very different final act. In those early versions, Alice escaped the Hive and returned to a city that was still functioning. Raccoon City had not completely collapsed yet. The effects of the T-virus were more uncertain, and the situation outside the facility was intentionally ambiguous. The story ended on a quieter and more uneasy note, rather than a full-blown apocalypse. But as production progressed, the creative team realized that a bigger, more dramatic ending might resonate better with audiences. Showing the world already devastated by the outbreak instantly raised the stakes and made the threat feel global. So the ending was reworked into the version we know today. Instead of uncertainty, viewers were shown a city already in ruins. The virus had clearly escaped, and the disaster was much larger than anyone expected. Number 3. Long before the Resident Evil movie we know today existed, the studio actually hired a horror legend to write the script, Romero. Romero was not a random choice. His zombie films had already shaped the genre, and the game creators openly acknowledged his influence.
It's the grandfather or the godfather of zombies. Zombies cannot run.
In fact, Resident Evil creator Shinji Mikami had cited Romero's work as one of the inspirations behind the original game. Romero had already worked with the franchise once before. He directed a live-action commercial for Resident Evil 2 in Japan, which is partly why he was brought in during 1998 to develop the film adaptation. And when he started working on the script, he went all in. According to Romero himself, he had his secretary play through the entire game while recording everything that happened so he could carefully study the story and atmosphere. He eventually wrote 6 different drafts of the screenplay. He even brought in legendary comic artist Bernie Wrightson to help design creature concepts for the film. But despite all that effort, the studio behind the project, Constantine Film, rejected Romero's script. The official explanation was that the screenplay was simply too violent and would likely receive an NC-17 rating. Then came an even more blunt assessment from Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto, who reportedly summed up the decision very simply by saying the script was not good and Romero was fired. Romero's version would have been very different from the film we eventually got. His story closely followed the game and included characters like Jill Valentine, Chris Redfield, Ada Wong, and Albert Wesker. Either way, it remains one of the biggest what-if moments in horror movie history. Number 2. Before the role of Matt Addison went to Eric Mabius, the filmmakers had another actor in mind. David, at the time, was already well known to genre fans because of his role as Angel in the television series Buffy the Vampire Slayer and its spin-off Angel. He was actually the original choice to play the male police officer character who becomes Alice's main ally during the story. But production timing created a problem. Angel was still actively filming during 2001, and the schedules conflicted. There were even later discussions about bringing him into the film in a smaller part, and at one point, he publicly mentioned that the project was still a possibility. In the end, though, he passed on the movie entirely. The role went to Eric Mabius instead, and the 2 major genre franchises stayed separate. Still, it is interesting to imagine the alternate timeline. Picture Angel himself wandering through the Hive, fighting Umbrella's experiments and blasting zombies in underground corridors. Number 1. The final sequence of the first Resident Evil movie was carefully constructed to feel like the beginning of something bigger. Alice wakes up in a hospital with no memory, walks through silent corridors, and steps out into a ruined Raccoon City. The streets are empty, buildings are damaged, and she eventually picks up a shotgun before pushing open the doors to the outside world. None of that was accidental. Director Anderson deliberately designed that sequence to feel like the launch of a much larger story. The Red Queen had not truly been defeated. The Umbrella Corporation was still operating, and the T-virus had clearly escaped into the world. By the time Alice stepped outside, the disaster had already grown beyond the Hive. She was standing in the middle of an outbreak that was just beginning to spread, and her memories were only starting to return. Anderson wanted audiences to leave the theater feeling like the story was unfinished without another chapter. As it turned out, he was absolutely right. If you caught new layers here, hit play on my Ghostbusters Secrets next.